If you want to learn JavaScript as a beginner, this is the series for you. Hey everyone, I'm Ahsan, and in this series I'm going to teach you JavaScript as a beginner. So this is a combination of multiple videos and Twitch streams. Let's go. Alright, so let's talk about variables in JavaScript. In JavaScript, we have certain type of variables like boolean, string, number, array, object, undefined, and null. We are also going to discuss in this video about type of operator, scoping of variables, let, const, and var. Let's talk about variables first, and we'll start with the scoping. So first of all, if we want to declare a variable just like person, and let's say we say Ahsan Ayaz here, and then later on, if we go ahead and console log person, just like this, when you run it, you will see that on console, we get this message that says Ahsan Ayaz. So this is the value of this person variable that it contains. So a variable in JavaScript is just like a box in which you can have different sort of values. But variables in JavaScript are dynamic, which means that they can be of any type and you can reassign the same variable using different types. However, in C language or Java, this is not the case. We first define the type of a variable in those languages and then we assign the value. But here, every type of value can be assigned into a variable. For instance, I could go ahead and do person equals to 1 here, which means that this is a number type value assigning to the person variable, and if I log now, you see that the value output is 1. So JavaScript does not care whatever the value is or the value type is that you're assigning to a variable. Now let's see an example of other variables as well. For instance, here we could have a variable and I'm declaring this using var for now. So let's say we have a var person Ahsan Ayaz. Similarly, we could have the age, let's say 31. And here, let's talk about some other type of variables. For instance, we discussed number and a string, but we could also have a boolean. So for instance, I could say something like var is married, and here it could be true. So we can have the value true or the value false as a boolean value. For the number, we could have 31, but we could also have 31.24. So we can have floating point values as well as simple integers as number values. For strings, we would have a string value between these double quotes. So you could use a double quote or a single quote, it doesn't matter. But a string has a lot of characters and is usually used for things like words, addresses, names, and whatnot. So here I could have like a really big string just like this, and would still be valid. If I go ahead and press play, you can see that this is what we console log. Now this could also have some numbers. For instance, I could have something like 1, 2, 3, 4, E. And if I do this, you can see that we got this number out. And I could also have something like 31.24. But this time, this is a string. This is not a number. So there's a difference between this variable, and that is the type of value that they are containing, although these are variables. Now let's talk about some more variables. For instance, we could have an array. An array is a data type which has more than one values in it. For instance, we could have a basket variable, and in this basket, we could have multiple values. For instance, we could have an apple. So here I'm creating an array of string values. So let's say we have apple, we have banana, and then we have grapes. Now the syntax of writing an array is you have different values separated by commas, but they are enclosed within these square brackets. And this is how you generate an array. So once you do so, if I go ahead and log basket, you would see that here we get this array logged out, which contains 3 different values. Now the array variable is not limited to have only one type of values as elements. I could have this number value as well as the third element in an array. So here you can see that now we have apple, banana, and the number value 12 here. Similarly, I could have a boolean here. So I could say something like false. And here you can see that now we are going to have this value. So an array is just a combination of multiple elements or a container of different values, but they could be of any type. And each array could also contain nested arrays as well, but let's not go there for now. You're going to learn it later on. So here we have an array. Now let's talk about an object. What does an object look like? An object is created by defining it like this. For instance, if I had to create a student, I would create the object by first defining these curly brackets. just like this. And then it's all about just creating keys and values. For instance, a student can have a name. So here I would have a name key. Then I would say colon, and here I can define the value for this. Now this key is just a string type, which means I cannot do one name here. This would be incorrect, but I can say name1, that is fine, or I could say name. So this has to be a string value. Now the value against this key can be any of these types. For instance, this name could be 12. This name could also be a string. So here, let's say if I type Ahsan, this is of the type string. Similarly, we could have another key value pair just like this. So we could have something like age, and here we have, let's say 31. Similarly, I could have another property here, which could be is married. And here I would have something like false, for instance. And here now I can have another property. Let's say it could be books. Now this book can be an array type. So here I can define an array using the square brackets. So first I'm gonna name my book, which is Angular Cookbook. Now this is an array that you would see just like this, because I'm enclosing this into square brackets. So now you can see that this object contains a lot of properties, which are the keys here, and each key has a value, and this value can be of any type that we have discussed above. Now if I log this student variable, you will see that it looks something like this. This is an object which contains all these properties, and each property has a value just like this. You're gonna learn about objects in a later video, but we are just discussing the type of variables that you can create. Now that we have discussed boolean, string, number, array, and object, let's talk about undefined and null. When you create a variable and when you log this, you will see that as undefined because it is not assigned with a value. Let's create a variable, let's say country, or let's say my country. Now you can see that this statement right here is just a declaration statement, which means that we are declaring a variable here. And this statement here is both declaration and assignment. The reason for this is that we are using this equals operator, which assigns a value to a variable. So here we're saying that, hey JavaScript, take this value 31.24 and assign this to this variable. In this case, we are not assigning any value. This is just the name of the variable. So if I log this down here using console log, you can see that the output is undefined. So this variable has a value undefined, or you could say it doesn't contain a value yet, but still it shows undefined because of the reason that this value of this variable is not defined at the moment by us. If I do just like this, then I'm kind of assigning an empty string to this variable. So if I do this, now you will not see undefined, but you will see an empty string. I could say something like 1, 2, 3 here, and if I run this, you see now 1, 2, 3. So when we don't assign a variable, we get undefined out of the box. Now we're also going to talk about null. Now null is quite similar to undefined. The difference is that null is something that we ourselves assign to a variable on purpose. For instance, we have this my country variable. If I do equals null, that means that now if I log my country, it would say null. The question is, why would you use it? There could be multiple situations where you have a variable, but you don't have an initial value of the variable, and later on the value gets filled. For instance, let's say if I check this console log right here and I define a value. For instance, let's say we have this student here and the name is Ahsan. Similarly, this person, this could also be, let's say, Ahsan. So I could have a condition just like this here. If student dot name equals person, then we have a value difference in, let's say, age. So let's say this age or this my country is null, but I could then say my country equals, let's say, Pakistan. So here, if I was to log my country, what would happen? You will see that now it says Pakistan, and the reason is that the student name value is exactly Ahsan and the person is also exactly Ahsan. Since they both are equal, we are comparing it using this double equal sign. So since they both are equal, we are assigning the value Pakistan to my country. In this case, we get a variable Pakistan. But in case they were not similar, let's say if this was Ahsan Ayaz, and if I run this now, you will see that now it's null. So at this point, if this condition was true, we got the value Pakistan, otherwise we got null. So here we can check, hey, is the country null or is the country not null? So I could have something like if country equals null, and I'm going to use double quotes here as well, then we could say something like console.log country pound. So if I play this, you would see that here, or actually this should be my country. Let me fix that. So here you see that it says country found because they both of the values, sorry, it should be country not found. So here, if both of the values are the same, we would get Pakistan. Ahsan. Otherwise, we would still have the value null. So since the value is null, we can compare it using null and then we can show this message. Now the thing is that if they both values are same, then what would happen is that the compiler would come here, will check these out and will assign the value of Pakistan to my country. And then this condition will not be true and this will not be logged. So if I play now, you will see that the console remains empty. So the null value is often assigned in our code on purpose. So we can use that somewhere else in the code to compare it with. Hey, is it null? No, it's something else. Therefore, we identify the values are not equal or it doesn't work as intended. For instance, now that we know about null as well, let's talk about typeof. So typeof is an operator which essentially tells us what is the type of the value that a variable contains. So this is used with multiple variables and in multiple situations it has different outputs. For instance, if I wanted to just console log out the type of each variable, I would do something like this. So let's say console.log here, and then I could say type of, first let's say type of person. So the person variable here has a type of string. So if I play this, you will see that this is of type string. Similarly, if I use my country here, what would you see? You would see object, because null is something that is derived from object, but we're not going to talk about that much here. But essentially the type of null is object. Everything in JavaScript essentially is an object by default, but there are subclasses like string, number that we can also use. So for the age one, you will see that here the type of age is number. Now, as I said, it's important to understand that this null has a type of object. This string is a type of string. This number is a type of number. This boolean, which is married, if we check this out, see what outputs. It's called boolean. So you can know what is the type of a variable in certain cases. Similarly, if I do basket, now as I said, everything in JavaScript is an object. So an array itself is also an object, and an object which is student, it's also an object. So if I just go here, you can see that it says object. So this is the type of variable situation, right? So I hope you got it. Now let's talk about scoping and let const and var. Scoping actually tells what is the scope of a variable and if a variable can be used within that scope or not. For instance, I'm going to comment all this out just like this. And now we're going to talk about scoping. I'm going to bring all these things at the very bottom. But here, let's suppose if I declare a variable with nothing like no var, let or const, what would happen? If I do Ahsan here, what would happen in this case? If I console.log person, what do you think would happen? Would it throw an error? Would it scream? Would my PC explode? Or would it be fine? If I click the play button, you see that we get this variable without any issues. And the reason is that when you don't define var for a variable, it actually binds this to the global scope, which is the window object. For instance, if I was to say window.person, what do you think would happen? In this case, we'll get the exact same output because this person is actually bound to the window object if we don't define var. Let's say if we define var, what would happen in this case? If I hit play, you will see that it's exactly the same. All right. So this is the global scope. That's why anything that we define here would be assigned to the global scope. But what would local scope look like? Let's suppose we have a function and we call this function main. And inside this, we have another variable. Let's say this person was to define right inside here and not at the global scope, which is here. If it was defined in this scope inside a function, then the scope of this variable becomes this function. It doesn't go outside of it. So if I do this, let's say if I was to add a console log here, I would do something like console.log. Here I could say inside main function, and here I could say something like person. Now what would happen in this case is that when I call this function, it would come inside, do this, and then it would go and then call this. So if I hit the play button, see what happens. It says inside main function Ahsan. So it got the value of person, but then it says undefined. And the reason is that this window.person variable is not defined because it was declared within this function. If this was outside, there would be no issue. So if I play this, you see that we get inside main function Ahsan. That means that this variable is actually accessible within the function, within the main function, and it's also available now outside the function because it's already in the global scope. And the reason for this is that every inner scope can access a variable from the outer scope. So this inner scope where we have this console log, it is using a variable from the outer scope, which is global scope. And this is how it works. But anything which is inside an inner scope is not accessible outside the scope. So you can see that here window.person or person, it doesn't matter what you type, they would not work. One of the reason is that if you don't declare a variable, if you are defining defining or trying to access window.person, it's a different case. But if we don't define that, then what it does is that it starts searching this variable here, and now it would say no, it's not defined, and it will throw you an error. All right, what happens if I remove this var from here? What do you think would happen? Would it again explode? Would it work? Would it not work? Let's see. If I hit play, you see that it works. Why does it work now? This variable is inside this function. This is crazy, right? And when you think it's crazy, then I would welcome you to JavaScript world, because that's how it works. So essentially, this person, when you don't say var here, this again is bound to the global scope, which is the window object. So even if I go here and check window.person, you will see that here, if I play, you see exactly here, and I can say the same thing here, just like this. So window.person. In this case, it's going to do exactly the same thing. So we need to define var, and that's how this scope is limited. Now, if I do person here and window.person here, you will see that they're going to be different. It's not going to be the same thing. All right. Now that you understand a bit about the scope, let's discuss something. Let's say if I have a var person here and we do something like, actually, I'm going to cut and paste this here. Let's say we have a var Ahsan here, and then inside here, we change the person to something like Mohsin, right? Because you would think, why would I declare another var here? Because we already have this function here. Now, the thing is that, as I said, the inner functions are able to access the outer variables. So if I change this Ahsan to Mohsin, you will see that here we'll get the inner value changed, but also the outer one, which means that this same variable has now its value changed. And even within this scope, it's changing, and for the outer one as well. Now, this could be a problem when you have things like, let's say, iterators of something like var I, which you initialize with 0, but then also you want that 0 to just be here when you do a console.log. So in this case, you would want to say, hey, the console.log should also show the value of I0, because I'm going to print here something, for instance. But if someone else creates a function and they go inside and change the value of I to 100 without you even knowing, then what would happen? This I value now would be changed. It will not be 0, but it would rather be changed to 100. And that is a problem. So for scoping, what we can do is that we can use the var variable here. And if I do this, then you see that the topmost thing is still 0. If I say var person, we have the inner value changed for this person, which is Mohsin, but the outer value is also changing, which is right here. All right. But there's also one more problem. And that is, let's say if this was the code and I was logging person here, let's say we had some lines of code here. So now when someone is writing this code here who says person, they would be assuming that, hey, it is initially assigned on line number 17 as Ahsan. But let's say if someone comes in the code and then they also change at line 23, something like var person equals someone else. Now, the one expecting this to be Ahsan would not know that there's another line in the code that actually replaces this var variable. So if I kind of print this, you see that here it says someone else, which is this guy here. All right. So why does it say someone else? Because first we have this person variable declared here, but then someone else also came here and upgraded this variable, and that's a problem. So that's why we got let variable that kind of avoids this exact case. With the let, you cannot redeclare a block scope variable. And here we have a block, which is the global block. If I declare this variable with let, I cannot use another let here, which means if I hit play, you will see that it would say identifier person has already been declared. And this makes sure that one scope only has one variable declared with that name. Now the thing is that with this let being declared outside, it's perfectly fine to declare let here inside, because they are two different scopes, and that's why it doesn't hurt to actually use these values. So here I could say something like let I equals to 0, let person equals to Mohsin, and if I change I to 100, then this guy would not be changed as well. So if I hit play, you see that inside it's Mohsin. So we changed this here and then we log it here, which is Mohsin, but then the outer person is still Ahsan, which you can see here. All right. Similarly, this I was 0 here, but we changed the I to 100 inside this function, which is via this block variable. So only the value of this I got changed, but the value of this outer I did not change, which we are logging here. So I hope this makes sense because this is how it works. Now we also got one more thing that is called const. The const is a variable that you cannot change. So if I declare this I equals to 0, just like this, let's say we don't have this variable here and I'm now changing this I, which means I'm changing the outer variable from inside since I'm not declaring that in the scope. What would happen? If I play, you will see an error that says assignment to constant variable at blah blah blah. So here it makes sure that if you have a constant variable, it has not been reassigned. So when it comes to defining a constant, you cannot reassign the value of a constant because this will remain always the same. Consider pi as a constant, and here you would have something like 3.1415, and you can add that to how many digits you want. But let's say if this was a pi, I should not be able to replace pi because it has a constant value, and that is the idea of treating constant. So if you know a variable that has a value and its value is not going to be changed, that's where you're going to use a const. And when you know that there's a variable whose value can be changed within, then you're gonna use a let. When you have different scopes and you want the variable to be only limited to that scope, then you're going to create this variable using let. All right, and this is not just limited to functions, it is also limited to, let's say, if blocks as well. For instance, I could go here and say the person here is Ahsan. Then let's say we don't have this function at all, just like this. But if I go ahead and say if person equals to Ahsan, then what I do is that I'll say something like let person equals to Mohsin, and I console.log person here, and I also have a person outside. So let's say this has a label of second log and this has a label of first log. So in this first log, we expect the value to be Mohsin, but in the second log, would that be changed or not? Because this variable is right here. I'm gonna actually move these here, change it to here, remove this line so we see this better. We got a variable called Ahsan. We got a constant here, but we don't care about this one. This person is being compared and inside an if block, and we are then running, or I could just say true here, doesn't matter. So let's say if this condition triggers, we create a variable, assign it to Mohsin, log this, and the variable has the same name as the outer variable. Would this second log be Mohsin, or would that be Ahsan? So if I play this, you will see that the first log is Mohsin, but the second log is Ahsan, which means that this variable that we declared of the same name as person has the scope of only this if condition. So it's only valid inside these brackets. As soon as it goes outside, then it starts referencing this outermost variable, or which is the person variable. So I hope this makes sense, and clears a lot of concepts for you. In the next video, we're going to discuss about JavaScript functions. See you there.
Alright, I hope that you liked the video. If you did, press the thumbs up button and also subscribe to the channel. And if you want to support my channel, you can support me on Patreon for as low as $5 a month. That really supports the channel grow. And I'm gonna see you in this next video. Till then, happy coding.